Ladies and gentlemen, I have with us our very esteemed guest, Mr. Adam Wilkinson. And thank you for joining us on today's episode of Artifact, Adam. And what you should know about Adam is that Adam is a distinguished expert in heritage conservation and cultural management. Adam is best known for his tenure as the director of Edinburgh World Heritage, where he played a crucial role in preserving and promoting the historic fabric of Scotland's capital. He also served as the secretary of Save Britain's Heritage, an organization dedicated to safeguarding endangered historic buildings across the UK. And recently, Adam was a chief heritage officer at the Diriyah Gate Authority, DGDA, in Saudi Arabia, overseeing heritage conservation strategies in Diriyah, the birthplace of the Saudi state. His work there focused on the UNESCO-listed At-Tarif district and its surrounding areas, ensuring the integrity of its mud brick architecture while integrating it into the contemporary urban development we are seeing unravel today. While a career deeply rooted in balancing conservation with modernity, Adam continues to contribute to the global dialogue on how heritage can shape our future. Hello and welcome, Mr. Adam.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have this conversation with you.
The pleasure is all mine. So what we want to know, of course, you've been working in Saudi Arabia for many, many years, and the project that you're most well known for working in Saudi Arabia is the Diriyah project, which is the birthplace of the Saudi royal family and the genesis of the first and second Saudi state, and of course greatly influenced the creation of the third Saudi state. But tell me, what first drew you to heritage conservation, and what was the defining moment that made you say, this is what I want to do with my life?
It's a wonderful question. I spent much of my student years wondering what to do with myself as my friends became bankers or lawyers or what other wonderful professions there are out there which give a reliable source of income. And I fell in love in the first year with historic architecture. We had this amazing history tutor, and in a large lecture hall of maybe 200 students with long benches raked up, he would stride up over the benches, over all the students, to put his slides into the projector, which he then click through, click, click, click. And as he went through these one day, he was looking at Norman architecture, but in the Near East. And in my head I said, hang on a moment. There's all this amazing architecture I'm familiar with in the West, in the Levant. And it started to talk to me about cultural exchange and the fact that a culture which was common to England on the northern fringe of Europe was there the very east and southern parts of what might have been defined the outside of Europe. And it carried on through, and that Roman architecture then carries through the whole way into Saudi Arabia from much earlier as well. So understanding this made me start to think more broadly about architecture and what it tells us, the historic architecture tells us about society. And then later on, in my third year at university, it was a 4-year course, we started to look at Islamic architecture. And it started out with this amazing tomb appearing up in Samarkand, not in Samarkand, sorry, in Bukhara, the tomb of Ismail the Samanid, from about 900 or so. Suddenly out of nowhere, this perfect form of architecture appears, which then develops and evolves into forms of Islamic architecture which we see when combined with the original versions of the mosque which appeared in Saudi Arabia. And these combine into this extraordinary flowering of artistic creativity, reflecting the different societies within the Caliphate and then more wider into the Persian Empire and then the wider Islamic world as well.
Amazing. I guess it's a lesson in how connected or interconnected we've been for essentially thousands of years. I mean, I think people imagine the ancients being very separated from one another because their geographies were vastly separated, of course, I mean, due to their modes of transportation.
Yeah.
But what you're saying now even makes it even clearer how interconnected we were and we have been for a very long time.
Absolutely. Ideas travel with people, and people are always moving around for trade purposes, sometimes for political purposes, but generally there's always a movement of people, and with the movement of people comes a movement of ideas, and upon some of those ideas around how we build and create our spaces and how people relate to them as well.
So Adam, when I was preparing the second question, we don't usually imagine that the humanities use methods or they have kind of international practices or there's like an agreed approach to how to deal with the realm of humanities. And so I was doing a little bit of research, and apparently there's something called the Venice Charter and the Nara document. And I wanted to ask you, how do these charters and documents affect the work, or did they affect the work that you did with Diriyah? And how are they going to affect the work that our colleagues are doing at the Royal Commission for Al-Ula?
It's a great question. They represent, indeed, a very broad science around heritage. And we'll come to that ecosystem a little bit later. If I can first explain really how I see heritage,
please.
as that then gives you some context. So usually we think of heritage as being an object, being something which is there and maybe in a museum or maybe it's a house. Whereas, in fact, heritage is it's a lens through which we look at the world. As individuals, we look at an object and we ascribe to it certain values. We might say why it's important to us. It might be the house you lived in as a child, or your grandparents' house even, which you have shared memories of with your cousins, with your parents and with your grandparents. And that starts to form a sense of community and identity. And so there's a series of value around that sort of heritage value for your own personal heritage. And that can then scale up to a community identity and to a national identity, through that sense of understanding who you are and where you're from and what those shared values are. And that's very much what is happening in Saudi Arabia as a nation at the moment. It's an amazing time to be here, a rediscovery of identity, looking back at the past, re-understanding all of these different aspects of Saudi Arabia and what that means in terms of who we are and where we're from. And so that broader view of heritage can take in the built environment as we know it, the towns, the cities, the beautiful mud buildings of Diriyah or the stone buildings of the Asir. It can take in wider places, perhaps the landscape around a town. That historical village could not have survived without the dry wadi where the water was diverted during the flood season into its fields. And those fields reflect that wider ecosystem. These are contained sort of places. So it's not just a building, it may be a town, it may be a landscape, which is part of your heritage. But it may also be the natural heritage as well of that area, of the migratory species which come in because of the way that landscape is looked after. And so heritage becomes this very broad way of looking at the world. Now, there's a whole academic ecosystem which has grown up around heritage, as you indicated, through the Nara document and the Venice Charter, and then you've got borough charters and all of these. What they're trying to do is give a way of managing heritage. So we start out with the Venice Charter at the very beginning of all of these, which is really trying to say, what is authenticity when it comes to heritage? Now, this is a question which is much debated, and it varies on where you are in the world as well. So let's say if we're looking after stone buildings in the West, which decay very slowly, the authenticity of those is marked by time. The hundreds of years of patina are on them. Whereas if you're dealing with a mud building in Diriyah, if you don't do any maintenance to it and don't regularly recoat it in mud, it may fail in 10 or 15 years. So there's very different approaches to authenticity. And Nara is a Japanese document which starts to look at this and looks at questions around intent and how you might look after these things differently in different cultures. So ultimately, as professionals working in Saudi Arabia, we're looking at ways to adapt international best practice around heritage to meet the local architectural history and local values and find a way of managing heritage which is appropriate to Saudi Arabia. That means not being lectured by people from different cultures with different views on it, but finding the common ground within their work and adapting it to the local situation.
Working with the objective facts, or quote-unquote the science of this. And I mean, one thing that I think as laypersons, I always wonder, how do you know what it used to look like? Like, are you working off a photograph? Are you working off of an old documentary? Are you working off of like a postcard that you uncovered? How are you estimating what these areas used to look like?
Yeah.
And how are you, like, I'm not expecting that you would give us like the billion steps it takes to reach that conclusion, but kind of take us through the process for a lay person. Explain it to me like I'm fine.
Yeah, I absolutely will. So look, a critical thing is that you take informed decisions. You act on information which is accurate and correct. If you don't know the answer, you don't take the action. So you don't go around recreating towns or buildings if you don't have the right information. If you do that, then it's as good as Disney in some respects. We want to avoid that at all costs. And indeed, Saudi Arabia has been good at that. Everything I've encountered has been based on a real scholarly study to understand what things look like from documents, from old photographs, from floor plans, and from comparative analysis. Now, this is something which we do in heritage and also happens in archaeology as well.
It happens in biology as well.
Absolutely. So it happens across this. It's the whole way which academia has grown up is through comparative analysis of other areas and other places and how things happen, which allow you to make suppositions and move on from there. So that's what tends to lead on these sorts of things. But the basic principle behind conservation should always be minimal intervention. You take the minimum intervention required in order to manage a structure or a building or a place through into the future. Often the temptation is to take heavy interventions into structures, which can result in them losing their original fabric and their original meaning as well. You can see some cases where ill-informed decisions have been made across the world around heritage, which lead to really buildings which have no heritage left.
Zombie buildings.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, and that also then removes the way in which the community values them as well. And you want to keep those links between buildings and community, or help build those links between buildings and community as much as you can to ensure their long-term survival.
But I mean, sometimes drastic interventions are required. Like, I can't imagine if the city of Venice, for instance, doesn't take any drastic decisions.
Yeah.
What's going to happen to their heritage?
Absolutely. Well, they have taken drastic decisions, and they've put this enormous dam in the lagoon in order to prevent the huge spring tides. And that's a hugely expensive and quite controversial measure, but also a very effective one. And then they've been working to reduce the impacts of tourism there, and particularly the cruise ships as well, which required the dredging of the lagoon and therefore increased the tidal flows coming through. So they have taken very drastic actions there at a huge scale. And that's less a conservation intervention. That's more about mitigating the impacts of change and trying to control those as best possible. So there are lessons from all around the world as to how we can mitigate change and try and manage change at a high level. So conservation, it goes from the very micro detail of how we conserve a piece of wood through to those huge actions you're talking about to conserve an entire area and prevent negative change. So again, conservation at that level isn't about stopping change. It's about managing it and ensuring the change which happens respects the character, authenticity and appearance of a place.
And I mean, essentially, I'm thinking, of course, about the response you're giving to me, and this theme keeps on coming to me, which is this is change created by climate change or by environmental factors. But then I realized as I was continuing listening to your answer, in fact, all change is created by the environment and by...
Absolutely. If we do nothing, change happens.
Absolutely.
You know, if it rains, it's going to wash mud off a building.
Even if
it freezes, it's going to have a freeze-thaw action on the stone architecture, wherever it may be.
Yes.
And so doing nothing creates change.
Yes.
It's a huge dichotomy. Once you realize that, you realize you can't stop it, but you can steer it. And that's really what we're trying to do in conservation management.
There's a lot of prepared questions here, but I mean, I wanted to really ask this question.
Dive deep.
You know, if you built your house out of mud, then you were probably not expecting somebody to show up from the UK one day and say, "Hey guys, you know, this is the way we could preserve this." Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if I built my house out of mud, I was obviously assuming that one day this would not be there anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
were you really assuming that? I don't know.
And
let's say that's the only materials you've got. So you've got a scarcity of materials. And this is the magic, actually, of the Nejd, is that you have a complete scarcity of materials. You are hundreds of miles from the nearest sea. You've got no major forests. The stone is very hard to work. You don't have the right tools. So you use what's available to you, which is really good clay.
Yes.
And you intersperse in that your limestone, which eventually calcifies to create very, very strong mud bricks, indeed, mud bricks. You know, if you look at the ruins of Atreif, they're nearly 300 years old. And the stone, the mud in there, the mud bricks are like stone. They're as hard as stone. When we were doing some of our conservation testing, the performance structurally is fantastic. No, you couldn't get a drill bit into these things. They're absolutely... So because of that old bits of limestone calcifying, it almost turns them into stone.
Wow.
So they were built with a view to lasting a long time. If you look at the some of the mud architecture in Africa, which is hundreds and hundreds of years old, the Great Mosque at Timbuktu,
You're right.
Every year the community is there putting a new mud face on it to protect what's at the centre of it. And that's authentic through the habits and through the community activity.
Amazing. And so, but then you have to there's a decision here to be made. This needs to be preserved. Decision is being made.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, how do people make those calls? Like,
Yeah.
and does it have to be specific to the the areas they're working in? But people in general, human beings in general, how do they make those kind of decisions?
It's about values and what people value. Now, from a Western point of view, the way this whole thing grew up is a long and torturous story, which brilliantly can be ignored by and large in Saudi Arabia, and it can choose its own way forward. But the decisions come about through a process of thought and deliberation and study. So what is the importance of a building or of a place? And those thoughts are usually done through the lens of architecture and history, because that's what the antiquarians decided around about 1650 was important. But more recently, we're able to look at much wider values, particularly what is the social value of a place? How is it important to a wider community in the past and now? And so sometimes looking to preserve a place. It may have been the place where people met to discuss the politics of the day. Now, there may be no buildings left, there may be just that place. And that then inspires how you manage that into the future. You can give it its original function again, a place for people meeting maybe. Or perhaps it was an area was a historical farm. Well, do you know what? We still need farms. Maybe that area should still be a farm. And the way in which you might farm it might change, or you might look to use the old ways as well, because those old ways actually ecologically are amazingly friendly and
they're more sustainable.
Reliable. Absolutely,
yes. Yeah. That's why they didn't change for thousands of years.
Absolutely. And coming back to those small ecosystems, they were actually the perfect circular economy and something which can inspire us now.
Absolutely. There's so much to learn.
Yeah.
And we think of ourselves as being so much more sophisticated than the people who lived before us.
But perhaps,
perhaps there was a system or a sense of wisdom that they were following that behooves us.
And particularly in the oasis as well. When Saudi Arabia has these oases dotted across the country, those confined ecosystems have so much more to tell us. And we can learn from other oases around sort of the dry parts of the world as to how they managed and how they've looked after those into the future as well. There's common ground to be built there internationally.
Going to Al-Ula, with your perspective, if I was to travel to Al-Ula very soon, walking around Al-Ula into the oases with you, I feel like I'd see Al-Ula in a completely different...
Let's do it.
Yeah,
Let's do it. That'd be great fun.
That'd be amazing. But speaking of Al-Ula, Al-Ula has invested in training locals to become custodians of their heritage. What is the role? What is the real role? Not the PR role. What is the real role of having locals be a part of the custodianship, the stewardship of their natural or cultural heritage?
There's lots of levels to this, and it's a great activity for many reasons. Apart from local employment, which is important, getting people to be of their place, they are able to give a really good authentic experience to visitors. This is something which is important to me, therefore I will explain it to you, visitor. But actually having people who value a place or an object or a building is a way of ensuring that the government stays true to its responsibility to that building and place as well, through people saying, I care for this, therefore if there is change I will go and talk to the authorities about it.
Mm-hmm. And I'll lobby on its behalf.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so what it's doing, it's creating a virtuous cycle of helping people understand and care for their place, enforcing and strengthening local identity, and creating a general pressure for it to be retained into the future as well as creating income streams and being attractive for visitors to the country to learn more about the place. So it's a clever move on multiple levels, and it's not just a PR move.
But it didn't happen for the case of the Ganges, for instance. The Ganges, one of the most important places in the Indian world, now is polluted and really suffered under the stewardship of a lot of people who care a lot about the Ganges.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is, you're trying to manage an asset there which is several thousand miles long with 500 million stakeholders. That's something which is extraordinarily complicated.
Yes.
At the time of industrialization and the upscaling of farming as well. So,
and with the huge population increase.
Absolutely, population increases, urbanization. So you're dealing with pollution at all levels there into the sacred river. An enormous challenge.
And so the lesson to be learned here is, I guess, there has to be a mixture. I mean, the most reasonable strategy would be like a hybrid system between people who can care about, for instance, the Ganges in different ways. You have a hydrologist, you have a person who is an expert in that region's culture, heritage, history, with somebody who is perhaps the expert in rivers, perhaps in pollution mitigator. And so you, as the heritage expert, where do you fit in building this kind of community? Do you give sessions to them? Do you tell them what are the high priority items or high priority places in this project or in this destination? Like, what is your role in terms of the local community?
It requires enlightened leadership, and we're really lucky in the kingdom to have that. As what you want to try and do is have heritage upstreamed in decision-making processes. So at the very outset, when somebody's saying we're going to look at developing or changing an area, you have the information about heritage there and its values made clear so that those decisions are then informed by that. And this is what's happened in Diriyah, happens in Al-Ula. And if we take the scale of, let's say, the Ganges, as you were talking about, trying to manage that, when it comes to decision making about the Ganges or any site anywhere in the world, I don't know why we're talking about the Ganges, but we are. It would, if you have the heritage considerations up there at the very start, then it will filter down through the whole process. Instead of what usually happens is that someone comes along with a plan and says, right, we're going to build this new structure right here. It goes through all the processes, and at the very end, the community and the heritage guys put their hands up and say, hang on, this is going to do lots of damage to the heritage, stop. And they run a campaign, they get the publicity going, it stops the development, it has to start all over again, everyone gets very angry, it creates friction. Whereas instead, if you have those heritage decisions at the very start, and the developer had said, hang on a minute, there's some old stuff here, let's understand what we can do with our development and change in order to respect that, you end up with a solution which is much more sustainable and which gets rid of that friction in society as well.
And I guess it does a lot to increase the pride and ownership people have of the the communities they're a part of and the land that they're living on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Otherwise you get a rejection. And if you look at some of those towns across the UK, for example, where there were heavy changes made in the 50s and 60s, there's generations which reject that and tell you that the urban planners did more damage than the Luftwaffe in World War II.
Yes.
I'm not sure that they did, but but still that sort of attitude has happened and people have lost that. Whereas actually in Germany, they rebuilt back in the historic style in many of the cities in order to keep the cultural memory alive, which is a really interesting approach as well.
And that is a huge complaint, and I think all over the Western world. I mean, being from Texas, there's a lot of people who complain a lot about the artificial, artificial culture or the artificial heritage or the over commercialization of their heritage, of their history, and now they're not connected to their site, or they're not connected to their destination, they're not connected to their geography anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that's another reason why you do what you do, is because you keep people enthusiastic, you keep people, I don't want to say loyal, but you keep people still interested in being a part of their community and their community's cause and their community's history and heritage.
It's even more than that. Without people, heritage has no meaning. There's no point. Absolutely no point at all.
Right.
What do these buildings and structures and places do? They tell us about people in the past. They tell us about their attitudes, how they looked after places, what was interesting to them. The actual layout of a building tells us about social structures. The nature of the fellage of the water canals can tell us about how the farms were managed. We can do a dig into that soil and pull out DNA from plants from hundreds and thousands of years ago, which can tell us about what was farmed there and what was right for the soils. So there is so much about the link between people and heritage which is critical. And if we forget people when we're conserving places, then we may as well pack up and go home or call it a museum. It's a very different game when you're conserving for real people in real places.
Speaking of people, when you're developing these very large areas, perhaps not as large as the Ganges, like we mentioned before.
Yeah, put that one to the side for the time being.
But when you look at a project that used to work for Diriyah,
Yeah.
and a project that we're currently working on, Al-Ula, how do you strike a balance between attracting people to the destination, yet preserving the cultural assets and the authenticity of the area? I don't want to call it destination because it makes it sound like it's only there for tourism. So how do you strike a balance between, all right, tourists, we want you to come, all right, local community, we want you to be engaged and a part of this grandiose experience, which is not only about tourism, but also about the quality of their lives, the quality of the preservation of their culture, of their heritage, and of ownership, stakeholdership?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of learning from the rest of the world to bring in here. So a number of years ago, I was supporting colleagues in Dubrovnik who were struggling with this question. In Dubrovnik, they were struggling with the cruise ships coming in, dumping off thousands of people who would come into the town.
Dubrovnik, which is in Croatia.
In Croatia. So they dumped off thousands of people every day. They'd get into a coach, dump them in the city, they'd walk around the city, and then they would leave. So what Dubrovnik ended up with was too many people who weren't spending money there. The average visitor spend was something like 15 euros. Absolutely hopeless. All the money was spent on the boat, and the local operators of the coaches were doing it at the cheapest price possible to try and get business. So they went mass market by mistake because they didn't have the control over it. And they've been trying to unpick that ever since, and they're doing well. They're doing well at this. So what happened there was the town became overcrowded, and the visitor experience wasn't very nice. It was simply unpleasant. And so the learning there is to control your numbers and not go for the mass market. And Saudi's got this message loud and clear. It really has. You aim for your middle market. You try and get maximum visitor spend in the country. Now, Britain has been very good at fleecing the tourists, I could put it like that, of pulling the money out of the visitors and getting it into the local economy. Other countries less so. They've struggled with it, particularly those with beachside resorts where you have the big operators internationally build a hotel, take all the money, it goes back to another country. So the challenge is to keep the money from the visitors in the town or in the city or in the country and ensure that you're putting in a very high level or a high level offer to them so that you get the maximum benefit from those tourists. Now, when it comes to individual sites, you're looking to balance ultimately the conservation, as you say, and the visitor numbers. And the way of doing that is through the visitor experience. You want your visitors to have the nicest experience when they come to a place so that they come back and they spend their money there again, ultimately. And also so it makes them feel good in their heart about that place and it builds the identity and support for it. So the challenge is to understand what is your visitor ceiling, at which point the experience becomes unpleasant, and what is your conservation ceiling as well, at which point the number of people starts to have physical impact on the fabric. And you can calculate these, and there's various amazing...
So there's a matrix for this.
Yeah, absolutely. You can work it out. So carry capacity is one technical way of doing this. Visitor flows is perhaps a more nuanced way of looking at it, looking at the number of visitors per hour and how they move around sites. When we opened Tarif, we had no idea how many people were going to come and how they were going to use the site. And we were, after about a week, got a feel for it. People were coming there to have a beautiful stroll after a nice evening dinner and a relaxing time. It's quite different to a Western heritage site where you've got off your tour bus, you're excited for it, you want to get into it, and then you need the lavatory, so you have to have 4,000 stalls and everything else set up, and then you want to get the visitor shop, and you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and everyone runs around as fast as they can. In Tarif, it was a much more relaxed experience, which actually made it a really pleasant sort of site to be able to manage as well. And in that first year of opening, we had over 1 million visitors, which was hugely unexpected. I mean, that's an enormous number for a heritage site. And yet it never really felt crowded.
I live right next to it, and I'd never felt that it was, unless there's a huge event going on. But I mean, as a neighbor of Tarif, I'd never felt like you could almost forget that it's there. It's that well. I guess the traffic is that well managed in that area.
And that's down to the quality of the programming within the site as well. So when you're looking to interpret a historical site for the visitors, you look to draw them around the site in different ways so that you can spread the pressure. And through looking at visitor flows, you can understand where pinch points are, where it might get a bit cramped, and where you can look to move people away from those pinch points to other areas and give them other things to go and learn about within the site. And that's the very fine art, and we've got amazing colleagues who manage all of that within Diriyah, as I'm sure they have in Ula as well.
One thing I've noticed, as you said, a lot of people are going there as if the place is alive.
Yeah.
And it's not like, it almost plays the role of, if you could imagine, I guess, Buckingham Palace, if it was Buckingham Palace / park or Buckingham Palace / garden, because Tarif kind of plays the same, or Diriyah plays kind of the same role that palace plays in the UK. It is a hot seat of, a royal family and hundreds of years of of them being there and them creating a country, but also it attracts people from all over the country and all over the world to come and see it. It has lots of heritage. Yet one thing that makes that place, Diriyah, very, very different is that you can walk and stroll there and almost sometimes forget that this place was conserved.
Yeah, you can soak in the atmosphere.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the things which our CEO, Jerry and Zarillo, was really keen on was getting the lighting right. So as you walk around, you have the right ambience, and he was absolutely right on this. And he will happily admit, I'm sure, that he was like a dog with a tutor on this one. But he absolutely nailed it. And so as you walk around, as the evening is a key time to visit. For the Western listeners to this podcast, they're probably used to heritage attractions closing at 6 p.m.
Yes.
Well, today we close at 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, during Ramadan at 2 o'clock in the morning,
Yes.
and allow people to really soak it in at night time when the weather is cooler and when it's a more enjoyable experience.
Amazing. Tell us about the advancements in technology, such as the LiDAR and AI-driven restoration. And tell me, how do you see technology reshaping work in conservation? I know there's some detractors who say that it is impeding on conservation work because, for instance, AI might be programmed to focus on efficiency or might be focusing on aesthetics.
Yeah.
And not focusing on, for instance, some of the values that are more humanities-driven, human-driven.
Yeah.
And so is there a conflict, do you think? And I mean, I'm sure people are using some sort of AI for their strategies in communicating the conservation.
Look, there's a huge role for technology in conservation management as we go forward. Now, if you're going to use some parts of AI right now, they're not particularly great. I typed in the other day to AI, show me what a Anglo-Saxon house might have looked like, and it drew me a German cottage. So we've got a little way to go on these things, I think, so far. But where it is very, very useful is in LiDAR, as you noticed, which is a form of remote sensing for archaeology to understand where archaeology might be, therefore reducing development risk and helping us work where we might excavate in the future. It's also incredibly useful in terms of big data. So imagine there's visitor flows. AI can play an important role in that. Something which I was really interested in Edinburgh, we were looking at how we could use citizen science and mass data to identify the need for maintenance and conservation of the historic buildings in that site. So it had about 4,000 protected buildings in the World Heritage Site in Edinburgh. And there was no way that our small team of 11 or 12 could monitor all of these buildings. And so
4,000?
It's huge. The World Heritage Site in Edinburgh is enormous. It's a city centre. It's an entire city centre, and one which was built out over many, many years from the medieval time through the sort of 19th century, and of the highest quality. And so there's no way which you can keep an eye on all of those. And so we thought, well, you could use remote sensing perhaps with LiDAR or with heat detection to tell you where you've got issues. And then we thought, well, actually, there are some people who drive around that city every day. And perhaps, this is before COVID, so after COVID everything kind of stopped. But the idea was perhaps we could talk to the dustbin guys and attach cameras onto top of their dustbin lorries, which go around the whole city every day, get regular photographs, train our AI to identify the changes in that and be able to track patterns over time. So that was one sort of ideas we had. Now, we weren't able to advance it, but that's a sort of application of technology at a very practical level, which you could engage with. And there are many creative people out there who come up with a million ideas. Now, of course, there's always someone grabbing a headline, sending in a 3D print, some monument which had been recently destroyed or something like that. Yeah, okay, that's kind of helpful, but it's headline grabbing. Is it going to help the actual process of conservation? Not enormously. There's also a lot of examples in the past where technology has been introduced into the conservation methodologies, how we look after these buildings, which has actually done more damage. So the introduction of concrete in the 1920s ended up doing much more damage to buildings in the West than the traditional lime which was used. And other technologies may have come in which may have seemed great at the time, such as asbestos, but which then have difficulties later. And so in the
Cancer-causing difficulties.
Yeah, major difficulties. So we tend to look for the traditional ways to repair buildings. Something which we have done in Diriyah was look to reinforce walls with previously titanium rods, but also fiberglass rods as well. So very minimal intervention techniques there to strengthen the historic fabric. But generally, it goes back to the idea of minimal intervention. We can use technology to drive us to better ways of management and better solutions, but using everything which comes along straight away might result in disaster. You have to test it scientifically and rigorously first.
I mean, I've seen AI renderings of archaeological sites.
Yeah.
And I'm worried that people are they're mixing fantasy with history, and they are creating hype.
Yeah.
They might sell over exaggerated thing to potential visitors or potential investors or potential enjoyers of that destination once they saw the AI rendering of the heritage, and then they come to the site and they're like, well, this is nothing like what the AI thinks.
It's a pile of bricks. Yeah, I would say, look, I'm 50-50 about this one on the grounds that we've always had artists interpreting historical sites.
Yeah.
So as a visitor,
but the artist puts a little bit more intent and time into.
I'm sure, absolutely, and I'm sure that in time, the tools which are out there will be used more effectively as well. When you go to a site, an archaeological site, you'll often just see a pile of bricks, and as a layperson think, well, and yes. So what? Unless it's the pyramids, in which case it's pretty damn impressive.
Yes.
Whereas in reality, those pile of bricks might represent, a tiny part of a much, much larger city or a much, much larger event. And it requires some interpretation. It requires someone to help you understand what it was, why it was important, and who lived there and what they did. And through the through the magic of comparative study, we're able to often to tell that all through the artifacts which are found at a site as well. And so there's certainly roles in helping interpret and in firing the imagination as well. I mean, as a child being dragged around historical sites, it was always the ruins that fired my imagination. And there's a great guy called Christopher Woodward who's written extensively about ruins, a wonderful book about 20 years ago, which talks about the romance of the ruin and the fire. And when you go to Tereif, you have buildings which are being conserved and you have ruins that are being conserved, and they fire the imagination as well. Why is that a ruin? What would it have been like? And it helps to have something to guide you to understand what it would have looked like as best as possible.
As we're talking about technology, Adam, we want to know the future of heritage. What is there a future for heritage? I mean, people are concerned about it now. It is a huge global push. I think there has been for a very long time a global push to conserve, preserve, heritage destinations, heritage items, intangible, tangible, archives, registers. There's all these different ways of kind of communicating the importance and the need for heritage preservation. Was it conservation or preservation?
Conservation works better, I feel.
Conservation. But what is the future of this heritage preservation? Are people going to preserve our preserving?
They're going to preserve the preservers.
Yes.
Yeah, what is the future of the past?
Yes.
It's a wonderful question, and I think you have to look at it in terms of how society is moving. When you conserve buildings, it often reflects society's greater needs as well, particularly when it comes to reuse. So ultimately, I think integrating heritage into society, not having it as some separate object off to the side, having integrated into how we think, how we act, and bringing it to life through our daily activities as well. Our habits are part of our cultural heritage. The way in which we greet each other is part of our cultural heritage, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or whether it's in Texas. These are all a part of who we are and are things which we keep alive. So I think integrating heritage into our lives and remembering that it's just a pair of spectacles through which we look at the world, it's a way of looking at the world, come back to that original point, is a large part of its future. But I think you have to look forward as well as to what the risks are to our heritage as well. And a changing climate is undoubtedly one of the great challenges. Here we're seeing more intense rainfall events, which is going to impact the mud architecture. We're going to see changing patterns of climate in parts of the world, which will affect other parts of the world's architectural heritage as well, which were not designed for what is happening now. In Edinburgh, we spent a great deal of time making gutters wider in order to take increased rainfall. So that constant adaptation and mitigation is going to have to carry on with our historic environment to ensure it survives. But I think there's great ways of looking at how we make the most of what we have here from the point of view of strengthening society, but also in terms of diversifying the economy as well, which Saudi Arabia is very focused on at the moment.
What about you, Adam? What are some things that you wish people took away from your experience as an expert in heritage?
I think the most important thing is communication, what we're doing here today. my field, we have a habit of talking to ourselves in a language which we understand, which no one else understands. And about 20 years ago, I was working on a campaign to prevent the demolition of hundreds of thousands of houses in the North and Midlands of England called Pathfinder. And the idea was to make a mass impact on the housing market. And I was fighting at a national level, but also supporting local communities whose houses were threatened. I was on this one particular street, and it was a very humble street of small townhouses, terraced houses, row houses, whatever you might call them, different parts of the world. And I was talking to the owner of one, and she had in her window something saying, "Please save our pre-1919 houses." Now, that's what it had been described as in the literature, trying to get their demolition. In reality, it was a very decent house from 1860s, stone-built, water-cut, and a conservationist would be horrified at it because it had plastic windows and satellite dish. To me, that was a sign that she cared for it. The doorstep had a curve on it, from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of footsteps over the years, wearing it away from the habit of scrubbing the doorstep every morning, from the habit of tea on the doorstep in that area, which would happen. And they were communicating about these buildings in their terms. And so our role was to translate their concerns into the system, into terms the system understood. But also it meant talking about buildings, about the way people valued them, not just us architects and historians.
Wow. I mean, to be honest, it is a very noble pursuit. But it was a pleasure having you.
Oh, it's my
Adam.
pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time.
My
You've
pleasure.
been so generous with your knowledge and your experience. And we hope to have you again very, very soon on another episode of Artifact.
I should love to, and I look forward to walking through those oasis glades in Alula with you soon.
I can't wait. We're going to have so
Wonderful.
much citrus on the way.
Thank you.
Lola FM.
The sound of Arabia.